Welcome back. Well, more, of course, now on the situation involving scholar transport around the country. And you know the Legal Resources Centre played an important role in the South African Human Rights Commission's investigation into the situation in Northwest. Their submission instrumental in framing the crisis not just as an administrative failure, but, as the Human Rights Commission found, a systemic violation of the constitutional right to basic education. They also asked that people move away from blame shifting between departments and towards a national, legally binding framework for student safety. Well, the situation in Northwest very similar to what happens around the country. Claire Rankin is at the Legal Resources Centre and worked on this, helping parents put submissions together. She's also been investigating the situation in other parts of the country. Claire, good afternoon to you. When you speak to people about scholar transport, what are the major complaints that you get? I think many drivers would tell you what they see is unroadworthy vehicles going too fast.
Well, Stephen, I mean, it really does vary who you speak to. Primarily when we talk to parents, when we talk to children, and when we talk to schools, the main complaint is that you have unreliable scholar transport. You have many learners who qualify for scholar transport, but who just aren't receiving it. And you really, unfortunately, see a large number of unroadworthy vehicles on the road. When you talk to service providers, on the other hand, their main complaints have to do with the non-payment of invoices by the departments. And they really are issues that go hand in hand and really result in crippling our scholar transport service across the country, really.
So it's not just one province or two provinces. I mean, this seems to happen everywhere, and there'll be plenty of people who drive in different provinces of the country with their own stories, I'm sure.
Yes, it's an issue we see across the country. I think each province has sometimes its own nuances, sometimes its own struggles. In the Eastern Cape, where we do a lot of our scholar transport work, for example, the very widespread, very rural context of this province adds its own issues when it comes to service provision here, and it makes it a little bit harder for service providers to reach communities in more widespread areas, but by no means ameliorates the obligation on the state. It's definitely not an isolated issue, and I think also increasingly, and what we can see from the horrific accident in Thunderball Park today as well, it's also not a crisis that extends just to the public service. We also don't see enough regulation of scholar transport vehicles in the private sector as well, and that unfortunately leads to absolute tragedies like we've seen this morning.
What I don't understand is that every single community in this country will be united by one thing. They all want their children to be safe. And you would think that they would work very hard to do that. And that makes me think of the power relationship between the people who drive these vehicles, who provide the service, and parents in the community. And I made this point earlier to someone that I'm fairly certain that if parents go to a driver and say, you're driving too fast or your car's unroadworthy, the driver's going to turn around and say, well, then I'll leave your child behind. And then that community has no other option.
Yes, and it's a really unfortunate reality. And I think if you add in especially service providers in the public industry as well, those are service providers that have been appointed by the respective provincial departments of transport mostly, sometimes the Department of Education. And there also is an assumption that we can trust the government to appoint service providers that are driving roadworthy vehicles that are sticking and abiding by the rules of the road. But unfortunately, time and time again, it's also proven, even in that context, there is not really a factual basis for that relationship of trust. I think the situation that the South African Human Rights Commission details in their reports in the Northwest is a very good example of that, where because of funding constraints, the Department of Transport went for so long without actually completing roadworthy tests and assessments on public service providers. So there's a power dynamic for sure, and I think that's quite specific to the private industry. But there's also a relationship of trust that I think we often see abused in the public sector too.
What's going on in government that leads to so many of these vehicles being unroadworthy, so many people breaking the law when they're doing this as a professional service? Is there something that's happening in the educational transport departments that leads to this?
Look, Stephen, it's really hard to say for sure, but what we have been able to pick up on is that there is not a lot of coordination and collaboration in the public sector when it comes to scholar transport. It's a function that's shared by the Department of Education and the Department of Transport. And what that means is the Department of Education is responsible for identifying learners who require scholar transport and have to give that information to Transport, who really holds the budget. What we do know is that that process doesn't work very smoothly and often results in scholar transport not receiving an adequate budget. And when there is insufficient funding, not because necessarily government can't afford more, but because there hasn't been proper planning and proper coordination, you really then see service providers sometimes not being paid. You then also see, like we saw in the Northwest, the departments of transport foregoing safety inspections. And I think really we know there are many issues, but poor planning is a particularly big problem. And that's why we've been calling for national regulations to help better clarify what the process is and also clearly delineate people's obligations when it comes to scholar transport provisioning and set aside clear timeframes for them.
We know when government tries to deal with the minibus taxi industry that for various reasons the minibus taxi industry has a large amount of power in our society, and there are reasons why that is. Do the people who run or who drive scholar transport vehicles have the same kind of power in some way? Are they able to defy what communities or maybe even what provincial departments want?
Well, what we have seen is that there is a lot of organization within scholar transport service providers. And what we have seen is not necessarily an industry that unites to defy government, but rather unites to protest when they don't receive payments. And one can clearly understand why, service providers might feel forced into that corner. We don't necessarily think that's always the best course of action, but it is unfortunate ultimately that you see organization around issues of non-payment because of government failing to take their obligations seriously. We don't necessarily see and observe a lot of any kind of organizational pressure being placed on government outside of those kind of issues. And potentially that also might be a form of important social accountability that should be strengthened. And I think it remains within service providers and communities' best interests to also try and unite behind concerns around road safety and also ensuring that the departments do their bit in keeping vehicles roadworthy.
So, Claire, I hate to be this person, but I don't think you'll be surprised at what I ask you next. The Human Rights Commission has made many findings over the years for many reasons. In fact, often before cases brought by the Legal Resources Centre. I can think of issues around access to water, access to education, all sorts of things. Sometimes there is, in fact, a big change by government, and sometimes there isn't. We've had the findings in Northwest today. The orders, I think is probably the right word, or the instructions to the provincial government there. Do you think anything's going to change?
I think it's my job to try and remain optimistic that they can. And I think I have good reason for that. We have an issue that I think for the last 3 years that at least I have been working at the Legal Resources Centre has gained in traction across the country. And we really are starting to see it as something that takes focus both within our network of public interest legal organizations, but also within Chapter 9 institutes like the South African Human Rights Commission. I would hope that we find these decisions taken seriously by the department, but what I do know is even if they aren't, it provides an important source of evidence that can be used by activists and lobbyists and can also be used by organizations like the Legal Resources Centre if we ever bring applications compelling action from the government. Questions around the binding nature of the commission also stand to be answered quite soon by the Constitutional Court, and if that goes in their favour, you would actually be able to solve issues around non-implementation. But I definitely think, Stephen, this report is very important because it provides a clear illustration of the problem. And when we have those kind of sources of evidence, it's very easy to then try and bring a case that assists in trying to remedy that situation. Otherwise, we have to rely on often very ad hoc counts, things that are very spread out and not necessarily strongly centralized. And this is an important first step.
Claire, thank you. Claire Rankin, is at the Legal Resources Centre, as you can hear, been working on these issues for quite some time. Well, Let's update you on the latest of the third